Welcome to our Midtown Walk of Queer History with Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library, NYPL. My name is Reuben. I'm a librarian trainee here. This is my colleague, Rachel. And we're really happy to have you here today. Happy Pride Month, and I think an important part of Pride for me is learning about history and connecting to queer history from the decades and from around the world that we might not always know about. So one excellent way to do that is by coming to the library. NYPL has one of the premier collections of LGBTQ plus history in the world, and that includes the published record of academic and popular literature, rare books, little magazines, historical newspapers, at least 100,000 volumes, and over 300 archival collections. That has really hundreds of thousands of letters, manuscripts, photographs, posters, and other items. A lot of items are digitized, and you can also access others in the Manuscript and Archives Division reading room right here in the Stephen A. Schwartzman building. So I encourage you to check some of those out on our digital collections. Anyone can make an appointment for the reading rooms. You don't have to be a researcher from a university. You don't have to have any fancy connections. You can go see something you're interested in, and we're very happy to help you search as well for themes and topics and figures you might want to do some research about. So a lot of the personal archival collections in the library archives chronicle the lives of gay and trans activists and groups from the 60s, 70s, and 80s, such as the Madison Society, ACT UP, and Vito Russo. We have LibGuides as well, which provide starting points for research into a lot of different subjects, such as Black LGBTQ studies, Jewish LGBTQ studies, and there's one on Stonewall as well that was created for the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. And we had a major exhibit called Love and Resistance, Stonewall at 50, and you can find a lot of materials from that online as well. In 2020, the library added thousands of images by the photographer and artist Diana Davies to our digital collections, and that includes underseen and alternate views of 60s and 70s queer activism in New York, and that's images of important activists like Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson as well. We also have photographs by Betty Lane that contain images and flyers from Rivera and Johnson's organization STAR, Street Transvestites Action Revolutionaries, that was really instrumental in creating spaces for some more marginalized members of the queer community, including people who didn't necessarily have spaces or homes and needed support to find assistance from governmental and city organizations. And we also have hundreds of photos and papers of gay civil rights pioneers and activists, Barbara Giddings and Kay Tobin Lehusen. And these are images that document the gay rights movement before and after Stonewall. So Stonewall is one important part and like a landmark in queer history here in the US, but there are really lots of other moments as well, and we encourage you to do research into some of those, and we'll tell you more about some other moments in queer history in the city and around Midtown throughout the tour. We also have some really beautiful photographic portraits of leading queer writers, and that's over 200 images. It includes Allen Ginsberg, Adrienne Rich, Quentin Crisp, Sapphire, Vito Russo, Audre Lorde, Gloria Anzaldúa, Samuel Delaney, and Joy Harjo, among many others. So definitely check these out. These are by Robert Giard, and you can also find a lot of information on the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project website at nyclgbtsites.org. And we have a lot of our sites that we've picked and the info on the tour from that project. So we'll show various photos from the digital collections as we keep going on the tour. And we'll walk over that way on 40th Street to our next stop, which is the J.C. Leyendecker and Associates Studios. So we'll head over that way on 40th. Okay. So you can see that building there. It says Bryant Park Studios, and You can't really tell here with all the and the Ola and Stein, the coffee shop, but there's a real history to this Art Deco building. It was a home of J.C. Leyendecker, gay cartoonist in the early 1900s. And yeah, so you can see the big windows. It's perfect for making art, for illustrating. J.C. Leyendecker, who was born in 1874 and died in 1951, lived here for a decade, starting in 1910 with his partner Charles Beach. So Leyendecker was an acclaimed commercial illustrator, and he was born in Germany and then moved to Chicago as a kid. He studied art as well in Chicago and Paris, so a real cosmopolitan guy. He and his brother, F.X. Leyendecker, who was also an illustrator, both moved to New York in 1900. And then J.C. soon met Charles Beach, a man who was 12 years younger than him, and Charles was described by Norman Rockwell as extraordinarily handsome. And they lived at the studio for 10 years, and then Beach and Leyendecker were together for 48 years. So this was kind of queer relationship and a long-term partnership, of the sort that many people had, even if it was under wraps a little bit, in a city like New York. It was maybe a little more accepted and in artistic circles, but you can imagine what it must have been like for them to kind of go through the city and not have their relationship really accepted necessarily by family or all of their friends. And JC drew many famous illustrations over the course of his life and career. He did ads for Arrow collars and for Kuppenheimer men's clothing. And you can see from the photos we passed around, also from the library's digital collections, that many of these are homoerotic and have idealized figures of young white male athletes. And it's a kind of selling a lifestyle and marketing a lifestyle that's much more familiar today. If you think about all the ads you see on Instagram and tennis ads, or like the figures we see from tennis, like the big three. Or I wrote this script back when Challengers, the film, was a big deal too. So I'm referencing Challengers, thinking of that. And one very cool thing about J.C. Leyendecker is he also created many iconic magazine covers. So he designed 322 covers for the Saturday Evening Post. And that had a really big impact on culture. So that popularized the act of giving flowers on Mother's Day and the symbol of the baby as an image of New Year's. So he had a big impact on culture and popular culture in the early 1900s and is a real queer figure from that time period, alongside many other artists and writers, many of whom we know about today and many of whom we don't. I'm not sure exactly what floor his studio was on, but I hope when you pass by this building in the future, you think of Leyendecker. And I will pass it along to Rachel now. We're going to be going further into the park to talk about some of the more queer activist protests that happened in the 70s and 80s.
Has anybody heard of the Dyke March before? Yes. So that's our next site that we're talking about. The first ever New York City Dyke March took place on June 26th in 1993. It was organized by the Lesbian Avengers, and it takes place on the Saturday before New York City Pride March, which is always the last Sunday in June and commemorates the Stonewall riots. So the New York City Dyke March is and always has been a protest march. It's not a parade. The march is a demonstration of our First Amendment right to protest and takes place without permits or sponsors, in recognition of the Lesbian Avengers' beliefs that we must organize among ourselves to fight for our rights, safety, and visibility. So every year, thousands of dykes take the streets in celebration of our beautiful and diverse dyke lives, to highlight the presence of dykes within our community and in protest of the discrimination, harassment, and violence that we may face in schools, on the job, or in our communities. So any person who identifies as a dyke is welcome to march regardless of gender expression or identity, sex assigned at birth, sexual orientation, race, age, political affiliation, religious identity, ability, class, or immigration status. Regardless of any of that, you are welcome to join the Dyke March. One of the enduring features of the Dyke March that beats through its heart today is the sound of drum beats. So this has been a feature of Dyke Marches all over and began in the second annual New York Dyke March, which was held in June of '94. Over 20,000 dykes attended this march as well, and the Lesbian Avengers, the group that helped to organize, they didn't know how they would communicate because they weren't expecting that many people. The first one was not well attended. It was a lot smaller, and then the one in DC that had happened later that year was really big, so then a lot of people wanted to attend the one in New York. So they weren't expecting like 20,000 people to show up to it. So they didn't know how to communicate that it was time to line up behind the banner on 42nd Street. So a group of drummers began marching towards the banner, and all of the dykes followed the drumming out of the park. And so years later, Dyke marches all over, outside of New York, within New York as well. They still depend on the drummers to lead the Dyke March and signal to start. Now the group that does the drumming is Fogo Azul, which is like a big drumming group. And they start the Dyke March every year. It usually starts in this area. People like group up over here, and then it heads down Fifth Avenue. And so we'll head to our next spot now. And the pictures that Reuben had shown were from the first annual, 93, yeah. All right, we'll head to our next spot. Here we're gonna talk a little bit about like locations. They're a little further down, like past Times Square and like closer to like 6th, 7th, 8th Avenue. We're going to talk about the Gay Activist Alliance and some of their instances of activism that they did in this area. So a lot of LGBTQ plus resistant groups came to prominence in the 70s, a few of which were the Gay Activist Alliance, the Gay Liberation Front, and the Radical Lesbians. So right now we're going to focus on like the GAA. The GAA was founded in December of '69, about 6 months after the Stonewall riots. In response to that, and their records are housed within the New York Public Library Manuscripts and Archives Division. The GAA organized and took part in a lot of demonstrations. They popularized the ZAP, which is a form of political direct action designed to create a big public demonstration and to usually like embarrass a public figure or like a celebrity that has done something bad while calling the attention of both like gays and straights to issues of gay rights. So one of their ZAPs took place here in Midtown at the Fidelifax of Greater New York. And so Fidelifax of Greater New York, it was a building like kind of halfway down this block that is no longer, like Fidelifax is no longer there, but it was a private investigative agency accused of gathering information on the sex lives of individuals, particularly LGBT people and those thought to be, and selling it to prospective employers. So when asked how he could identify gay people, Vincent Gillen, the Fidelifax founder and president, and a former FBI agent, replied, "If one looks like a duck, walks like a duck, associates only with ducks, and quacks like a duck, he is probably a duck." So on January 18th in 1971, about like 20 GAA members, including the president, accompanied by the press and War TV, managed to get inside the 6th floor Fidelifax offices and attempted to pay for an investigation of Gillen, the founder and the president. Employees called the police and they threatened arrests. So the protesters joined their colleagues on the GAA picket line outside, and the group attracted a lot of attention from passersby and the press while holding picket signs and making shrill sounds with small squeezable rubber ducks, calling back to what he said. The single most noticeable GAA member was Marty Robinson, who was dressed in a rented duck outfit. And so in a really weird coincidence, the movie Shaft was being filmed in Times Square the day of the Zap. And so the opening sequence of the movie, during the credits, like when they roll in the beginning, Richard Roundtree is like making his way through the activists during the protest. If you like watch that movie and watch the beginning, he is walking through the protest and you see see signs. And so that was like a very rare live color documentation of a Gay Activist Alliance action, which is pretty cool that that exists. And another instance on Saturday night, August 29th in 1970, over 700 members of the Gay Activist Alliance, the Gay Liberation Front, along with the Radical Lesbians and other women's groups and gay youth, held a peaceful joint protest in Times Square calling for the immediate end of police harassment against the LGBT community. Some 300 individuals had recently been arrested on a variety of charges in like a cleanup of the area in like that month. And there were increased incidents like that in Greenwich Village as well around that time. So after marching 3 times around West 42nd Street between 8th Avenue and Broadway, the crowd headed to the 14th Police Precinct Station at 357 West 35th Street, where those arrested in the Times Square area were taken. Protesters eventually moved on to Sheridan Square and found that the police were right then raiding the Haven nightclub at 1 Sheridan Square, and the police attacked the crowd. GLF members regrouped and marched back to the Women's House of Detention, calling for its abolition. And women inside were incited to respond, shouting through the windows and throwing burning objects down on the street. Police arrived to respond to those inside and outside the prison. A riot began that lasted for several hours. A lot of destruction going on. 12 people were arrested and several police officers and others were reported injured. And although these demonstrations have long passed and the GAA disbanded in 1981, there is a piece of the GAA that still exists, and that is the Gay Switchboard. Initially, it was conceived in the spring of '71 by former members of the Gay Activist Alliance and the Gay Liberation Front, but it served as a centralized hub to safely and privately provide callers with information about queer-friendly establishments and to allow for open discussions about sexuality and queer identity with, someone safely on the other line. After a year of planning, the Gay Switchboard began taking calls on January 13th, 1972, making it the first and longest continually operating LGBTQ hotline in the country. Allegedly, it still exists. The New York Public Library Maps Division has maps of, at the time there were maps that were made specifically for queer people that had locations where you could be openly gay or openly trans in this boarding houses or bathhouses. You wouldn't like places that were safe to exist were on this map, and they have those maps in the Maps Division, and anyone can go in and look at them. I got to see them and they were very neat, and a couple of the places mentioned here are on those maps, which is pretty cool. All right, I'll pass this over to Reuben now.
Also, the GLF was more radical, and you can tell kind of from the names too, Gay Liberation Front versus Gay Activist Alliance. But the GLF, I think, connected the struggle for gay rights with the civil rights movement much more than the GAA did, and thought about liberation as something that's inclusive of lots of different groups in the country, versus the GAA was a little more focused on assimilation, I think.
Yeah.
As you kind of hinted out with Star, splits also happened along kind of lines of race and gender as being more expansive and not binary as well. Trans people felt more at home often in Star or other smaller organizations. I think there's still, definitely transphobia among some gay men and lesbians, and think of in the 70s, there's also and going on to today, TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminists. So there are all these political kind of lines of demarcation, and where people feel comfortable really depends on so many different factors. That includes political stances, class, and gender and race as well. And kind of on those themes, a lot of the bars downtown, like the Stonewall, were frequented more by white clientele, and they were also protected by the mafia. But some bars uptown had a much more diverse clientele, and they did not have the mafia paying off the police to protect the bars from raids. So one example of a place like that is Blues Bar, which was a predominantly Latino and Black working class gay bar on 43rd Street and 8th Avenue. And that is also right across from the New York Times offices. And the New York Times didn't write about this at first when there was a raid on this bar on September 29th in 1982 by the police. And the police shouted homophobic and racist insults at the bar's patrons. They were very violent. They injured 35 people. There were smashed pinball machines. They fired some bullets, and there was definitely like injuries, but they didn't end up arresting anybody. And contemporaries think that they were just trying to intimidate the poor population at the bar in part of an effort at gentrification and cleaning up Times Square, rather than there actually being some violation of the law here. So there was a large effort to gentrify Times Square and clean up what was an area where there was a lot of sex work and where there were Black and Latino and trans people frequenting the establishments there. So this was a really kind of race-based and class-based and gender-based raid. And again, kind of this was in contrast to the mafia-run bars downtown that excluded a lot of people of color at these bars. And the interesting thing about this raid on September 29th is that there's a big contrast as well between a kind of gay rights movement that was, as we've talked about, kind of already trying to gain credibility with the establishment. There was a human rights campaign, which is a much more mainstream organization, had a lot of money back then too, had a fundraiser at the Waldorf Astoria hotel over on Park Avenue that same day, where they raised millions of dollars. And Walter F. Mondale, who was the former vice president of Jimmy Carter, he spoke at that fundraiser that day, and he would end up becoming the presidential nominee for the Democrats in the 1984 elections. There's a real contrast there between what parts of the gay and queer community are accepted. And then there was another raid on October 8th, and community members decided to fight back the next week, and over 1,500 queer people marched through Times Square on October 15th, 1982, shouting "Hands off blues" and "Hey, hey, ho, ho, police brutality has got to go." And they formed the rallying cry, "Remember Blues," for later Pride marches. Activists at this march on the 15th included members of organizations like Black and White Men Together and Decks Against Racism Everywhere, along with many other organizations, a much more radical crowd. And they were trying to draw connections between the raid on blues, gentrification across the city, police sweeps of trans sex workers in Greenwich Village, and the targeting of lesbian bars in the city. Right now also kind of, and at this point as well, lesbian bars have been closing down across the city. So there's still some gay bars, predominantly gay male bars in Greenwich Village area, Stonewall and Julius's, that are still around. But gay bars as a whole have been closing, and that's affected lesbian bars particularly. And the raid on blues, even though the bar is directly across from the New York Times building, as I mentioned, didn't get any coverage by the Times. And there's some speculation that maybe the Times also kind of helped to prompt the raid on the bar, and but it did get coverage in the Village Voice, alternative newspaper at the time. And the Village Voice is also kind of not around anymore. It's very much a product of a different era. And the raid serves as a reminder of how most marginalized parts of the queer community continue to get the least support today, especially with everything going on right now in our national politics. There's a pattern of transphobic legislation and book bans across the country. Trans women are the target of violence as well around the country. And it's a reminder to keep paying attention to the ways queer violence and representation is an intersectional thing, and to think about the stakes for everyone in the queer community and not just those who might get the most attention in the mainstream media. So I'll pass it along to Rachel now, and we'll go to the Gertrude Stein Monument in the center of Bryant Park to end our tour.
All right, so this is our last stop, and we're here at the Gertrude Stein Monument, which was installed in 1992, and the casting is based on a model that Stein sat for by Joe Davidson in Paris in 1923. So born in Pittsburgh, Stein moved to Paris in 1903 and lived in France for the rest of her life. She met Alice B. Toklas in 1907, and then they lived together as partners after 1910. They famously hosted a salon in Paris that was attended by the leading modernist figures of art and literature at the time. And Stein wrote the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, but she was also like a poet, a novelist, a playwright, and an art collector, aside from being an author. So my favorite thing about this monument is not the monument itself, but about like what happened around it and with it in 1993. So on Valentine's Day in 93, the Lesbian Avengers reunited Stein with her longtime lover Toklas by creating a 6-foot plaster sculpture of Alice Toklas on a pedestal and placing it leaning against Stein. And so writers Eileen Miles, Jacqueline Woodson, Joan Nestle, Maria Irene Fornes, Maxine Wolf, Sarah Schulman, Yvonne Rayner, and a lot of others. They read excerpts of Toklas's love letters and Stein's poetry to a crowd of over 200, and they then danced in a lesbian waltz. And so the action, according to the flyer, which we have for you guys to see, or like a picture of it from the digital collections, was intended to celebrate and venerate the glorious history of conventional romantic love, politically incorrect domestic bliss, butch genius, forgotten femmes, queer biddies at large, lesbian odd couples and singles, and especially the union of Gertrude and Alice. And so one of the poems they read during the gathering around the two statues by Stein was called Miss Fur and Miss Skeen, and I'm going to read like a couple lines from it. So they were regularly gay there, Helen Fur and Georgine Skeen. They were regularly gay there where they were gay. They were very regularly gay. To be regularly gay was to do every day the gay thing that they did every day. To be regularly gay was to end every day at the same time after they had been regularly gay. They were gay every day, they ended every day in the same way at the same time, and they had been very regularly gay. And so that's from her poem. And this is the last stop, but you can see Gertrude Stein here. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to let us know. If you want to get a library card, you can get a library card at our library across the street.